Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriela Elizondo. I'm the practice manager of the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, also known as ESMAP. ESMAP is a partnership between the World Bank and 24 donors, including governments from developed economies and philanthropies, to help low and middle-income countries achieve sustainable energy and decarbonization goals. ESMAP has 29 technical programs. One of them is focused on offshore wind development. I am delighted to welcome you today to this virtual event for the launching of the new report entitled The Role of Concessional Climate Finance in Accelerating the Deployment of Offshore Wind in Emerging Markets. The report was prepared jointly by the World Bank and International Finance Corporation with support from ESMAP and ProBlue, which are both multi-donor trust funds of the World Bank. Offshore wind is critical to achieving global decarbonization goals and net zero emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, as you know. So this report on how to coordinate public and private sector participation and use concessional and climate finance to reduce the cost and deploy offshore wind is timely and extremely important. We have a group of very distinguished colleagues joining us today to open this event and to present and to discuss, launch this important report. The session will be structured in 4 segments. We will start with opening remarks by Demetrios Papatanasiou, Global Director for Energy and Extractives at the World Bank, and from Jamie Ferguson, Director of Climate Business at the IFC. Then we will have a short presentation of the report by 2 of the leading authors, Sean Whitaker and Mark Labor. And the presentation will be followed by a conversation with a very, very distinguished panel of discussants. And finally, we will conclude. Please note that the chat box will be open for comments and questions during the event. And of course, we will make every effort to answer your questions at some point. But if we don't have the time for that, you will have contact information for the team so that you can then contact them directly. So without further ado, let me invite Demetrios Papatanasiou for his opening remarks. Demetrios, over to you if you are connected. And I think we are still perhaps waiting for Demetrios. So then let me pass the mic to Jamie Ferguson, Director of Climate Business at the IFC, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Gabriela. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Nice to be with you all. Climate is a big problem. The IPCC tells us that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% on a global level in just the next 7 years. And to accelerate that energy transition and displace large chunks of thermal power is going to require large chunks of scalable, reliable, proximate to demand and affordable, sustainable power. And offshore wind offers just that. The scale is massive. The ESMAP IFC offshore wind development program has identified technical potential of over 16,000 gigawatts to be delivered in large chunks across 75 emerging markets. It's reliable to a much larger extent than wind and even onshore wind and solar. In fact, the IEA has stated that offshore wind is in a category of its own as the only variable baseload power generation technology. And it's well located. Often the wind resource offshore is close to the coastline where the large population and therefore demand load centers are in the likes of Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, Philippines, and elsewhere. And it can be affordable. We've seen that in Europe. Competition and scale of rollout has driven competitive prices. But all technologies have to start somewhere, and first installations hit a first mover disadvantage, higher transaction costs, a higher cost of delivery. And while we have seen this movie before with solar and onshore wind, the scale of offshore wind actually makes that rollout harder. It makes it harder to do the first pilot projects. It makes it harder to build scale incrementally through multiple projects, because frankly, each project needs to be in the order of 750 megawatts plus to make sense and justify the interconnect, the ports, and all the other aspects that come with offshore wind. So how do we get over the hump? This report seeks to engage us all in a debate around the important questions of what, where, and how. So the what. The report brings insight on the kind of concessional support that would be needed to get projects going in offshore wind in countries where you don't have the benefits of the likes of the Inflation Reduction Act to provide government subsidies on that scale. In fact, it estimates that 10 gigawatts of capacity across 10 countries would require in the order of 4.8 billion of concessional public debt, 8.3 billion of concessional private debt, and 2.5 billion in grants over a 5-year period to bring those first projects in at a competitive price. Now that sounds a lot, but in the context of the challenge of climate change and the context of Paris commitments of 100 billion of concessional support a year, it's small given the potential of the technology. So the where, the work of ESMAP and IFC's offshore wind development program has clearly identified significant opportunity in Vietnam, the Philippines, India, Turkey, Sri Lanka, Azerbaijan, Romania, South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, and more. All places where decarbonization of the energy sector is going to need significant increment of renewable energy, and offshore wind can offer it. So that leaves the big question, how, and that's where the conversation today begins. And the ambitions of this report is to start a rich debate with all of you on how we can make that happen. The report calls on a grand bargain, and Mark and Sean are going to engage us in that, and we're hoping to have a rich conversation about how we can partner up to make that happen. With that, back to you, Gabriela.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for this excellent and framing opening remarks about the importance and challenges of deploying offshore wind. So I have with me here Demetrios Papatanasiou. I don't know why I don't see my audio, my video, but I'm going to allow Demetrios to start while I figure out what's happening with the video. So Demetrios, over to you, please, for your opening remarks.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Gabriela, and thanks to everyone for connecting. Sorry, as we try to sort out a bit of technical issues. I will be very brief, and all I would like to say is that one of the key issues that we see, large-scale deployment of offshore wind, is the need for a lot of ancillary infrastructure. And that means that investments are very bulky, they're very substantial. And it's also investments, especially when it comes to the logistics and when it comes to refiguring how ports work and how logistic chains work, provide an opportunity also for other development benefits in the countries where we work. So I think the combination of offshore wind to be a source of clean energy and at scale, and the potential for the large-scale investments on offshore wind to promote additional development and additional infrastructure installments is what is very different compared to other work that we do in the bank. And I'm really looking forward to the conclusions of the report and how we're thinking about it and what is it that is more relevant for the countries where we work in. Without a doubt, we feel that offshore wind is key and important for the development of net zero policies around the world. And we are here as a World Bank group to support it as much as we can. Over to you, Gabby.
Well, thank you, Demetrios. We're still having trouble with the video, but we will continue. So Let me then turn over to Sean Whitaker and Mark Laybourne for their presentation on the report. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here today. My name is Sean Whitaker. I'm with the International Finance Corporation, and I'm going to be presenting the results of the report today with Mark Laybourne of ESMAP, and Mark and I are the co-leads of the World Bank Group's Offshore Wind Development Program. Wanted to acknowledge that this report was the result of a great deal of effort over the past couple of years. The other two authors with us, Oliver Knight of the bank and Fern Gray of IFC. And also want to acknowledge the contributions of many other colleagues across the bank and IFC. So over the next 15 minutes, we're going to describe some of the results that came out of this report on the role of concessional finance in accelerating the deployment of offshore wind in emerging markets. We first wanted to provide some of the context behind why we feel that there's a need for concessional finance in offshore wind. And then we're going to present some of the results of the modeling that we did, and then talk about next steps and what this means for emerging markets.
So through this presentation, we hope you come away with three key messages. Firstly, without access to concessional finance, low and middle-income countries will not quickly deploy offshore wind, and we feel that they may delay their decisions to commit to the first projects in the new markets. Secondly, the benefits of offshore wind are really best achieved through scale. This report proposes a vision of a substantial volume of concessional finance across at least 5 countries, which could in turn be seen as catalyzing at least 50 gigawatts of global deployment on an accelerated timeline. And thirdly, there is an opportunity here, as Jamie mentioned, for a grand bargain between donor countries and emerging markets to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind to mutual advantage. This is a big ticket opportunity to accelerate the pace of global decarbonization, and it can be combined with significant trade and export opportunities.
So to provide a bit of context for the program itself, this is a program that we launched in 2019 with a very simple objective of accelerating the uptake of the deployment of offshore wind in emerging markets. To date, the work that we've been doing has been supporting over 24 country governments, and the outputs or the work that we've been doing, first of all, on mapping of technical resource potential in many countries around the world. We've issued a number of global reports, including key factors for successful development of offshore wind in emerging markets, a report on Going Global, and these are all available on our website. And we've also held a series of study tours with decision makers from over 16 countries. And really, the bulk of our work focuses on specific countries, and we work with country governments to develop roadmaps that essentially put together all the pieces of the puzzle that have to be in place in order for offshore wind, for them to grow their offshore wind sectors. So we have, we published roadmaps in 5 countries so far, and then we are working on another 5 roadmaps right now. And then once we really see the roadmaps, frankly, as a means to an end. And once the countries get engaged in the roadmaps and understand that these are recommendations that they want to move forward with, then we provide them with advice, drawing on a group of expert consultants that we have to provide advice on regulatory, commercial, and technical matters related to the growth of offshore wind in their countries.
An important question for any government to answer when they're thinking about doing offshore wind is why develop offshore wind? And each country has got its own drivers that are specific to that market and political priorities. But here are a few common factors. Firstly, offshore wind can be delivered at large gigawatt scale. And in fact, it will be more cost competitive when it is delivered at that scale. And this can enable new capacity to displace large volumes of conventional thermal generation and help decarbonization. Its output is typically higher and more consistent than other forms of variable renewable energy, meaning it can be easier to integrate into transmission systems. And as land is becoming an increasingly precious resource in many countries, deploying capacity offshore avoids adding further demand for land. And in many countries, the economic benefits that offshore wind can bring are viewed as a similar driver to the clean power generation that it brings. Offshore wind is a unique and specialist supply chain that may be able to create many skilled jobs in new markets and bring economic benefits with it.
Of course, one of the big drivers behind offshore wind and the interest in it is just the scale of the resource that is out there. What you see here is a map from the Global Wind Atlas. It shows wind speeds to a distance of 200 kilometers off the shore. And pretty much any area here where you see yellow, orange, red is a really good offshore wind resource. So globally, there's about 19 countries that currently have offshore wind operational. There are another 30 countries that are currently investigating the use of offshore wind, and many of those are the emerging market countries that we've been working with so far. One of the remarkable things that you find about that resource is that, and Jamie had mentioned this before, is that it actually tends to be most vigorous closest to large demand centers. So coincidentally, you get very strong offshore winds very close to large cities and urban centers. The mapping that we've done across all World Bank countries is that there's a technical resource of over 16,000 gigawatts split between fixed foundation and floating foundation. So again, a really impressive resource and a very well distributed one.
While offshore wind turbines may look very similar to onshore wind turbines, that's really where their similarities end. Offshore wind is more complex, is higher risks, and takes a lot longer to develop than onshore wind projects. It requires sufficient size to create economies of scale, but this requires huge capex and places new demands on transmission systems to connect that scale of projects to the grid. And it also requires ports that are capable of handling the large components to build projects. So it's important to consider and treat offshore wind differently to onshore, as it requires much more public sector support and intervention. That said, given the right support, the benefits from a successful offshore wind market far outweigh the help that is needed to establish it.
So far, we've talked about the general context for offshore wind and some of the reasons why both developed countries and emerging markets are pursuing offshore wind. But ultimately, what it really comes down to is a question of price. And the offshore wind, in order to be considered a long-term competitive generation source in these countries, it has to be able to offer a competitive price. One of the lessons learned that we've seen in Europe, which is one of the birthplace of offshore wind, is that the first projects are always more expensive. There's a long learning curve that's involved in getting the sector started. As Dimitris had mentioned, it's a matter of getting in ports and vessels, and there's a lot of associated infrastructure. So getting over the hump of those first projects is really important, because they will be more expensive. And then once you get over those projects and that learning happens, then you're able to go down the cost curve very quickly, to the point where you see in Europe and many places, offshore wind is one of the most competitive forms of generation that they have, period. So how big is that gap? The chart that you see here shows the current prices for various technologies. Offshore wind, generally, the expectation is in emerging markets that its price will be somewhere between $100 to $120 per megawatt hour, so between 10 cents and 12 cents per kilowatt hour. And it's competing against thermal generation. And thermal generation is generally somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 per megawatt hour, so 4 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's really the cost gap that you've got. So you're looking at the first projects in emerging markets coming in, around $100 to $108 per megawatt hour, and they're trying to compete against thermal generation that's around $60 per megawatt hour. By our estimation, if you can close that gap down where offshore wind gets to about $70 per megawatt hour, we think at that point, that's when it really is competing head to head with thermal generation.
We've already talked about the need for concessional finance, but appreciate that some of you may not be familiar with this phrase. So in simple terms, concessional finance is really any finance that could be provided on terms or conditions that are more favorable than those available in the market. And this is typically provided by donors and financial institutions to support development activities, including climate change mitigation and adaptation. For instance, this could include long-term or lower-cost debt provided to the public or private sector, or grants which could be, for example, paid in the form of carbon credits.
So obviously, concessional finance is going to be a critical tool in our when we're trying to cover that cost gap that we discussed. So in order to figure out what kinds of concessional finance should be applied, it's important to understand where that can be applied within the the price distribution or the cost distribution of a typical offshore wind farm. So the diagram that you see here shows kind of the two major components of an offshore wind farm. It's the offshore wind farm itself, which includes the turbines, the foundations, the inter-array cabling, and then the electrical export system, which is to the right, which includes the substation, the export cable, and then all of the onshore transmission infrastructure. So in general, for a 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm, you're looking at a total cost or a capex of somewhere around $2.9 to $3 billion for the entire project. Of that amount, about 85% is in the wind farm itself, and about 15% is in the electrical export system.
There are many ways that concessional finance could be deployed to reduce the cost of electricity from offshore wind, and the analysis in the report is not exhaustive. It highlights a few of the ways that concessional finance could be used and should be seen as the start of the conversation on this topic. So each country will have its different needs and appropriate uses of concessional finance, and the design of that concessional finance package will need to be devised on a country-by-country basis. The analysis in the report considers how the cost of early offshore wind projects in these emerging markets could be reduced from a base cost of around over 10 US cents a kilowatt hour, so it's about $100 a megawatt hour, to more affordable and palatable level, which, as Sean mentioned, we've assumed to be around 7 cents a kilowatt hour or $70 per megawatt hour. The graphic here summarizes two of the scenarios presented in the report. It shows the effect that different financing approaches can have on the cost of energy for a representative 1 gigawatt project in an emerging market. So if we take the capex figures that Sean just mentioned and assume that in a base case, the private sector offshore wind developer is expected to bear all of these costs with finance at a commercial market rate. In that case, the cost of energy is likely to be around $108 a megawatt hour, which is equivalent to 10.8 US cents a kilowatt hour. In many established offshore wind markets, the electrical export system from an offshore wind farm to the grid connection is paid for and owned by another entity. So if the cost of the export system here is borne by the public sector transmission system operator using public concessional debt, this can help reduce the capex burden on the developer by around 15% and subsequently reduce the cost of electricity to become closer to 9 US cents a kilowatt hour. So this is a fairly simple intervention that's got precedent in many markets and has quite a substantial bearing on the fruits required by the project. But to further reduce the cost of energy, we've also considered introducing concessional finance to the generation side of the equation and supplementing some of the higher cost commercial finance. So in this second scenario, we've shown here at the bottom of the graphic, we've assumed that there is a concessional debt blended with commercial debt, which reduces the overall cost of capital for the offshore wind farm. We've also considered the use of a grant, which could be paid in the form of carbon credits, helping to reduce the capex, and this has a really substantial impact on the cost of electricity. So these two forms of concessional finance, coupled with the financing of the export system, can reduce the cost of electricity to around 7 US cents a kilowatt hour, which, as Sean mentioned, is a far more affordable and palatable cost than the base case we started with.
So Mark just described what concessional finance can look like at the project level. And as we said, a typical offshore wind project, in order to get the economies of scale that you need, has to be around 500 megawatts up to and even larger than 1 gigawatt. But in the report we stepped back and said, well, if given that that offshore wind scales the way that it does, the way that it requires all of this associated infrastructure that comes with it, what is the magnitude of additions that is going to be required in emerging markets in order to really move the needle, not just on one country, but in several countries at a time, and frankly, for the sector as a whole. And by our estimation, a global program to deliver 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and again, that consists of projects, what we call pathfinder projects, which sort of set an example for others to follow, of between 500 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts, applied across 5 to 10 different countries, is the scale that would really start to move the needle and really help to accelerate offshore wind in emerging markets as quickly as it needs to be done. That would require no small amounts. This is a total of around about 15 billion of concessional finance, including 4.8 billion of concessional public debt. And as Mark said, that's largely allocated towards the electrical export infrastructure. Would require $2.5 billion of grants. And if you take that and convert it into a carbon price, it comes out to about $5.90 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So relatively speaking, that's actually not a bad price for again, for the impacts that it's having. And then $8.3 billion in concessional private debt, and again, that's applied on the generation side. Take all those things together, those 10 gigawatts of projects across those 5 to 10 new markets are going to result in emission reductions of around 416 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is roughly equivalent to the annual emissions of Turkey.
So there's a lot of effort here, and so why do this? Well, really, the projections from both IRENA and IEA suggested that at least 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind will be needed globally by 2050 to reach net zero targets. And a substantial proportion of this will be deployed in emerging markets, especially those with growing economies and equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So it's important for these emerging markets to deploy their first offshore wind projects as soon as practical, as this will help to reduce the risks, begin maturing that market, and start that market's cost reduction pathway. In turn, this will reduce in sooner cost reductions for subsequent projects, reducing the requirement for future public support. But as we've outlined here and in the report, this won't be an easy venture. Support will be required across both public and private sector. And as we've seen in established markets, a close partnership and collaboration between industry and the government will be essential for success.
So to close, I wanted to come back to the three main takeaways that Mark outlined at the beginning. The report makes a clear case that without concessional finance, offshore wind will not grow quickly in emerging markets, and it certainly will not grow as quickly as it needs to in order to meet the very ambitious decarbonization targets that we've set under a 1.5 degree pathway. Second major takeaway is that in order to achieve this scale, we're going to need a large sum of concessional finance, around 15 billion, as a combination of loans and grants, in order to support 10 gigawatts of projects, of offshore wind projects in 5 to 10 countries. And then lastly, this is really an opportunity, and any challenge is accompanied by an equal opportunity, in this case for a grand bargain between emerging markets and donor countries alike, and it's a win-win for both entities as they seek to build up the global fleet of offshore wind.
Thank you very much for listening, and hand back to Gabriela for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Thank you for this succinct but very interesting presentation that elaborates a bit on the main takeaways of the report, the main conclusions of the report. So with this, let us start our roundtable discussion. We have with us today a group of very distinguished colleagues to help us discuss what is the role of concessional and climate finance in accelerating deployment of offshore wind. and to discuss experience with deployment in developed economies. So we have today Hannah Jersil, Chief Advisor of the Center for Global Climate Action of the Ministry of Energy and Utilities in Denmark. Welcome, Hannah. We have with us today Mitu Mistry, team member for multilateral programs at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero of the United Kingdom. We have with us as well, and hopefully he's joined us already, Dinesh Jagdal, Joint Secretary of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy in India. And finally, please let me welcome Rebecca Williams. She's the Global Head of Offshore Wind at the Global Wind. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I think this is a great opportunity for us to discuss and to focus attention on one of the solutions that we have in our toolkit of solutions for decarbonization that's going to play an important role in the future. And this reason is important that we start focusing and supporting offshore wind and understanding how to finance it, especially in the first phase of market development for the technology. So Hannah, let me start with you. Thank you for joining us. Please, based on your experience, the experience of Denmark, can you tell us a little bit of what role can offshore wind play in the energy mix for emerging markets? How has the sector's scale helped it to drive down costs in the case of Denmark? So over to you, Hannah. And you're muted.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And let me start by congratulating you on the report. It's extremely important to look at how to facilitate the uptake of offshore wind, and including in emerging economies, and finance is definitely a very crucial question to tackle. Well, you can say that based on the Danish experience, yes, offshore wind does have a very large potential in delivering renewable energy at scale for many of the reasons that you have mentioned already. So you can say that in the Danish case, it has definitely contributed to both reaching our emission reduction targets. It's also contributing to you can call it energy independence, and also to the green job creation, etc. So we do believe that many of these same benefits are some that other countries will see when they embark on the offshore wind journey. You can say that this is also why we have initiated way back, but do have quite a lot of energy partnerships with emerging economies, and offshore wind is one of you can say one of the elements we are collaborating on in many of these countries. This is also the reason why we have created together with IRENA and GWEC the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, exactly because of the fact that we do see a large potential for offshore wind, but we also do see a lot of barriers that we need to tackle together across both public and private stakeholders. So I think that's a very important takeaway from our side. When it comes to driving down costs, we believe that based on our experience that it's really crucial to have both scale, as you have mentioned, and also to reduce risks. So you can say, as you mentioned, the first offshore wind farms come at a higher cost. That's also our experience. It's extremely important then that you have a number of, you can say, risk mitigating elements in place in order to actually create certainty among investors. And this can be done, of course, in multiple ways, but stable long-term policies are really important. I mean, this is one thing. And then also you have, I mean, our experience is also that it's important to have, you can say, streamlined processes. We have used in Denmark a one-stop shop and have had the Danish Energy Agency as the body in charge. So these are, just to mention, some of the elements which we have had use of and which we believe contribute to actually ensuring a both stable and efficient environment around the development of offshore wind. Tenders also are, of course, also very important to ensure competition. And transparency around how you actually are working on offshore wind is equally important. So just to say that this pipeline of projects, that's really key, and all these different elements will help to provide the right conditions for that. But as you have mentioned, the first projects are definitely more costly, and this is also why it's really, really important to try to put the spotlight on what it is then that can help making these first projects attractive to governments, so that they feel ensured that this is a way forward they can take. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much for this response to the question. And I think you're right. No, there are a number of elements, and perhaps there is a number of elements that are necessary to deploy offshore wind that are similar to other renewable energy technologies. And you mentioned the importance of, robust processes and good permitting and, an efficient environment in general. All that is important, but we know offshore wind is a special case in the sense that infrastructure is complex, the critical infrastructure is a bit more sophisticated, etc. So the experience from Denmark is definitely very interesting. Let me turn to you, Mitul, with the same question. Based on your experience in the UK, the experience of the UK, what role do you think can offshore wind play in emerging markets? And also, what is your experience with driving down costs in the
Thanks, Gabriela, and thanks to Mark and Sean for the great presentation, and also the report, which is actually quite easy to read, so that's nice. So we have quite a lot of similarities with Denmark, and as with other countries that are moving away from fossil fuels to renewables, it's important that they have a good mix of renewable energy. And for us, in the UK, the wind and solar are major renewable energy sources. With offshore wind, we've seen a fourfold increase in our capacity since 2012. So that's been able to drive up the amount of electricity produced by renewables to over 47%. And we've seen that really in the last 10 years. And the UK has then made a public commitment by 2030 to have an ambition for up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, and we're currently at around 14 gigawatts. So we really see it as something to invest in, and that's been obviously supported by the UK government. In terms of driving down the cost, because obviously, as Hannah said, and as in the report, we did see obviously the first projects being very expensive. So in the UK, we've used a contracts for difference scheme, which has been really successful in reducing costs for offshore wind. So when the first auction was done in 2014-15, the cost was around £120 or $150 per megawatt hour. And then the last auction in 2022, that cost is driven right down to £37 or $46 per megawatt hour. So we've really seen a difference in cost as the scale that's there. And this scheme obviously really incentivizes investment by providing developers with direct protection from the volatile wholesale prices. And by making the public commitment for 2030, the UK government is obviously indicating to investors confidence that the offshore wind sector is going to grow and then provide that scale. And then around that, obviously, the increased demand is causing an increased demand for components, leading to competitive environment for procurement and driving down the, the supply chain costs associated with offshore wind. I'll stop there because I know you've got to get through quite a few questions, but thanks.
Thank you, Mitul. And I think the UK case is also quite unique in the sense that you have a liberalized market or a partially liberalized market. So then the policies, the regulations, the protections to developers are quite unique because you have a competitive wholesale market that's actually functional. So that's quite unique. But I think it's important what you mentioned about the mission and having a target, because without a target and a clear public sector mission, you cannot guide the stakeholders, right? You cannot guide the market in the appropriate way. So that's a very good experience from the UK. So let me go back to you, Hannah, with a question about, your opinion or your take about the role of multilateral climate funds in helping to address this gap. We have various global climate funds that are limited in amount, their volume. But what I think is the role of the multilateral climate funds in this, and of course the role of developed countries as well in supporting through grants, through increased concessional and climate finance of the development of offshore wind in emerging or developing.
Well, yes, as you just said, of course, you can say the concessional finance is limited. So I mean, we cannot unfortunately support all the good stuff that we would like to support. This is, you can say, the subject of concessional finance for offshore wind is a new one that you are bringing up now with this report, and we find, of course, that this is of interest to see how you can actually support the development in the emerging economies and developing countries in, I mean, when it comes to actually embarking on this specific energy technology. So, I mean, we do believe that, I mean, this can be a way of I mean, it is really important to break down the initial barrier of affordability, so that offshore wind can be you can say brought in at a competitive price. I mean, so that it can be the choice of emerging economies as well. So yes. As I see it, this can be a way of helping to mitigate, you could say, the risks in relation to the initial projects, right? But of course, I mean, it has to be seen also in the bigger picture of many different interests, of course, in the end. But definitely this is a new, you can say, area which is important to look at. And as I mentioned before, I mean, we do see definitely offshore wind as a very big, you can say, an important technology when moving forward in order to deliver on the climate targets and all the other important sustainability goals actually that we have. So yes, we do see this also as one of the potential means to address the present gap, so to speak.
Thank you, Hannah. And without any question, there are competing priorities always with the support or to concessional finance from developed economies, of course. Mitul, what would be your take from the perspective of the UK on the role of concessional or multilateral climate funds in addressing the price gap in offshore wind?
I think, as Hannah had said, I agree with her that, you know, we agree that the multilateral climate funds are key in removing the barriers to those first projects and giving confidence to governments to invest in these offshore wind projects. Obviously, the advantage of these multilateral funds is that they're able to leverage a larger amount of finance than we would be able to do as nations by ourselves. And, you know, most of the 11.6 billion that the UK has committed to international finance actually does go through multilateral climate funds, because we see the benefit of that, such as the Green Climate Fund or CIFs and even ESMAP through the World Bank. And I think the advantage of the concessional finance is that it can be both technical assistance and the financial assistance that's required. And often, you have to make the investment in the technical assistance first, like ESMAP is doing, providing support to the countries on their offshore wind roadmaps, to be able to make that move into the investment for offshore wind. So definitely we see a key role for multilateral funds in helping us get over this barrier. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitu. Thanks so much. And unfortunately, I don't see Dinesh Jagdel connected. So I'm just gonna move on and address you, Rebecca. I'm gonna turn to you with the question about how, or is the, I mean, we know that the offshore wind industry is now becoming truly global. Apart from China, of course, it's an important industry, but it's not really scaling up in developing economies. The deployment is very low or very incipient in low and middle income countries. So is there appetite from the industry to venture into developing economies? What do you hear from your constituency?
Yeah, thanks, Gabriela. And I think the key reply to your question there is not yet. We're not yet seeing development in a wider set of countries, but what we are seeing, and for those of you in the audience who've read GWEC's most recent offshore wind report, which we published just a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that actually now appetite for offshore wind, as you said, is truly global. And we're seeing plans in place in every continent apart from Antarctica now for offshore wind. I think the story in low and middle income countries is one of great appetite for offshore wind. And we're seeing that clearly coming through in targets that are being set, in proposals which are now being put forward. To name a few, for instance, Vietnam has recently revised its power development plan. We're seeing lots of progress in the Philippines. It's a shame that Secretary Jagdali can't be here with us, because I know that he'd be talking very eloquently about India's plans in this space too. So I think the picture is really exciting. It's just how do we catalyze that ambition and move that towards implementation? And from an industry perspective, all the countries in the world who want to pursue the offshore wind opportunity are kind of they're all competing for resources, for investment. And I think anything that countries can do to make their investment proposition more attractive is going to help them catalyze this ambition and move projects towards deployment and implementation. And what I mean by this is, as the report clearly states, CapEx is a huge chunk of the cost of offshore wind. And anything that we can do to further de-risk CapEx, to reduce that and to bring about more favorable rates for projects, and also for supporting infrastructure, which was mentioned earlier, such as grids, such as ports, that's going to attract international investment, and it's going to be a lot more attractive for international developers. So I think this report, and congratulations again on the report, is a really vital contribution to addressing this CapEx question, to joining the dots and moving us from a place where we're talking about ambitions and targets to a place where we're talking about implementation and project level conversations.
Thank you, Rebecca. And indeed, addressing the CapEx question is perhaps the most important, the risking as much as possible. And of course, as the report establishes, and it's a very well-known problem across all renewables, there must be a good coordination between the public and the private sectors, because here you need a combination of measures, right? From missions to specific policies and regulations, to a development plan for the power sector that includes, in this case, offshore wind, to robust permitting, and of course then the finance and the risking, both the cost of capital and the cost of debt will depend on the enabling conditions in the ground. So this will be very important. Rebecca, so what do you think are the main challenges when you think of this coordination between public and private sector? We think are the main challenges for developers to be able to deliver their projects and deploy offshore wind in emerging economies.
Well, maybe just to add to what you just discussed there, Gabriella, I think this question of the balance of risk is a really important one. And any country who's considering offshore wind should think carefully about the balance that they want to place between the risk being placed on developers and the risk being borne by the government. And I think when we're talking about this risk, there's pros and cons and benefits to either approach, to allowing developers to take more of that risk, and also for the government bearing more risk. And there's different models out there which governments can choose to pursue according to whether they feel that they have the kind of logistical and administrative capabilities to take on some of that risk themselves, or whether it's better and they feel more comfortable allowing developers who are very experienced in the deployment of offshore wind across multiple different continents, places, etc., to bear some of that risk. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there with a key consideration. When we're looking at the kind of challenges and barriers, I suppose, to offshore wind, some of them have already been mentioned. So in some countries, absolutely, we are seeing that this kind of gap between the current power price and the price that offshore wind would come in at is something which is of a key concern. I'd say that pretty much every market, every country that we work in is finding investment in grid a significant issue. I'm sure my colleagues here from the UK and from Denmark will smile at this because it's a universally acknowledged problem, which I think there are different solutions now on the table to. I'm not sure that anyone's got the perfect answer yet, but I'm sure that also concessional financing in this space to support wider grid infrastructure could be a really exciting proposition for many of these markets. And then I think the other kind of key challenges and barriers, which really nicely fit into this conversation around financing, are things like permitting, getting a kind of array of bankable projects out there. Ultimately, there is capital in the world which is willing to flow into offshore wind. But what this sector is seeing, what the industry is seeing, is that we just don't have enough bankable project propositions yet. So again, I think that anything that can be done to speed up those processes, to reduce risk in those processes, is going to really help reduce some of these bottlenecks and move the conversation forwards. And then the last thing that I'd just touch upon is that so far we've talked about offshore wind as if it's this discrete energy priority. But actually, I think we'd all acknowledge here that offshore wind is providing significant socioeconomic benefits to many of the countries that it has been built in. But that really needs to be accompanied by a proper industrial strategy at government level if we're really going to realise the benefits of offshore wind. One of the key components there is around supply chain scale up, supply chain investment, and how do we catalyse an effective supply chain, both in country, but also at regional and global level. And again, I think there's great scope for public-private sector collaboration here. There's great scope for government-to-government collaboration. Really pleased that Hannah, who is my colleague in the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, has already mentioned that as an initiative, as a forum for some of these kinds of collaborative conversations. But I think by working together in this collaborative fashion, we can unlock many of these challenges and really advance the deployment of offshore wind in line with the targets that have already been mentioned.
Thank you, Rebecca. And you mentioned very important comments. And of course, we need a pipeline of bankable projects. And I think at the bank and at the IFC, we are precisely focusing on this. We're trying to create the pipeline of projects that will allow us then to start scaling up and demonstrating the benefits of offshore wind in emerging economies. And the other important point that you made that I think is fundamental is the issue of industrial policy, because for renewables and for the decarbonization options, it's not only that they make sense for the environment and for the planet, but also that they must make sense for the society and for the economy from the, let's say, from the industrial policy point of view. And this is extremely important. I think we are getting very close to the end of our session. Thank you very much, Hannah, Mitul, Rebecca, for these insightful comments. Thank you for joining us today. And so let me go to the last stage of our session today and ask Deep Nguyen Van Houte. She's a senior manager for innovation and business development at the IFC. to help us offering some concluding remarks. So Deep, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Gabriela, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their great insights, and thanks to Sean and Mark for their excellent presentation of, as all the panelists agreed, a very well-written and very readable report. So what I heard today is agreement among the panelists that the good news is there is a significant demand for offshore wind development in emerging markets. The World Bank Group program with ESMAP and IFC has already supported 24 countries, and there's a higher demand, continuous demand for our support. We also agree on the significant impact of offshore wind, including the impact on GHG emissions, a great source of jobs, and we've also seen how other renewable energy technologies like solar PV has been a great source of job creation for markets like China and India. And we've seen that offshore wind can be successfully done, and it was successfully done in Europe. I still remember reading the case study of Ørsted, how Ørsted used to be Dong Energy, a state-owned enterprise of Denmark, and it was mainly thermal, relying on thermal energy. And in the beginning, when Dong Energy was trying to move to offshore wind, there was a significant apprehension, and there was a perception of risk. And what's important to remember here is that it is the perception of risk. And therefore, the government had to step in and have an industrial policy where the government agreed to provide the first loss guarantee and some other risk mitigation instruments to incentivize the private sector developers to do this, as well as Dong Energy. And but the good news is Dong Energy did take that leap along with some investment funds, including the National Pension Fund. And the even better news is that the guarantees were never necessary. So there was the perception of risk, and then everyone took the leap of faith. And the good news is that we know where Ørsted is today. It's become a huge renewable energy developer, a global leader in offshore wind development, and a profitable company. And so I have a lot of faith that offshore wind in emerging markets will go in the same direction. It requires public and private interventions. It requires governments to set policies that incentivize development. And here again, we've just seen a recent example of the United States through the Inflation Reduction Act, setting policies that has hugely incentivized offshore wind development. And that current prices at recent auctions are at $50 per megawatt hour. So prices are going down, and we are benefiting from the trends in in developed markets and lessons in developed markets being transferred to emerging markets. What are the sources of concessional finance? Well, we know there's climate investment funds, there's the Global Environmental Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. And hopefully in the upcoming COP, we will see more commitments for scaling up the blended finance for the CIF and other funds to support offshore wind development. The MDBs can help governments finance the transmission infrastructure that's necessary, which account for about 20% of the cost already. And governments and MDBs can work together to help develop local supply chains. And of course, developing supply chains also means, again, positive impacts on job creation. Some of the implementation challenges that I heard today include setting policies for permitting, seabed rights, dealing with environmental and social challenges. And from the demand of some of our private sector clients to the IFC, we've also seen that support for addressing local benefits, job creation, community concerns is also important, and that's how we are being engaged. which hopefully will also lead to some first mover projects. With that, let me wrap up and thank everyone for joining for an excellent session. And you know who to contact, Sean Whitaker and Mark Laybourne. Always ready to answer your questions. And we look forward to subsequent sessions, future sessions, where we can talk a bit more and in depth about de-risking instruments, guarantees, insurance, and other blended finance structures. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Deep, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the participants, the panelists, and congratulations to the team that worked on this excellent report and delivered it and launched it today. Thank you very much and have a great day, everyone.